without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Matt. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself and tell folks what we're talking about today?
Sure, yeah. I am Matt Warner. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Blumira. And today we're going to be talking about kind of moving beyond what is generally looked at as compliance and the checkbox and getting proactive about risk management, specifically around credit unions and the glory of NCUA and all the compliance that comes with that. And today I have Jim Goldman with me, the co-founder and CEO of Trava, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Hi, everybody. Jim Goldman, CEO and co-founder of Trava. I kind of eat, sleep, and breathe risk management. It's a passion that I've been pursuing for the last 30 plus years. Most significantly was Vice President of Security Governance, Risk Management, and Compliance for all of Salesforce globally. So certainly comfortable with talking about risk management on small scale or large scale.
You've seen it all.
I've seen it all.
Yeah,
I've
that's
seen
always
too much.
too much. Well, yeah, I think that's probably how a lot of us feel in the industry, right? Especially at this point. And as I had said, I'm Matt Warner. I'm the co-founder of Blumira. My background is in, security, as you could imagine, defensive and offensive security, and coming up with solutions that make people not hate what they're doing when they're leveraging their security tooling, which is always important since most of it is quite terrible, generally speaking. And today we're going to go through a few different topics. We're going to talk about the agenda here in a second, but I like to kind of level set and talk about for us, for Blumira, and just generally kind of how we look and at the world. And I'm sure, Trava and us, we've worked together and we had kind of have a similar view as to what's happening kind of across the world, as well as inside of risk management and compliance. And in general, credit unions are a great and growing part of the financial instrument that is inside of the US. And it's important for them to kind of, and y'all to follow the NCUA compliance, but we all know it just gets harder and harder every year, especially with legacy systems that are a part of that, making sure you continue to make your auditors happy at the state level and just broadly trying to make sure everything is going the way you want it to, and making sure that that's working with usually not a budget that's growing every year across that IT and security team. So today we're going to talk about, in three different sections, we're going to talk about credit union challenges. We're going to talk about strategic solutions to kind of how we look at the solutions being solved, how we've seen them be solved, especially in the market as well. And lastly, how you can partner with Blumira and Trava, and how you can best kind of work with us moving forward. So first, we're going to touch on credit union challenges. We know, and especially y'all know, that it has been continuing to change year over year. More compliance requirements come in every year associated with credit unions, everyone, of course, but especially credit unions. And the NCUA, while being a great governing body, does continue to deploy these requirements into credit unions without kind of what we were just talking about, continuing to grow your budget to solve those compliance problems. And especially what we see is kind of across these three different areas that Jim and I are going to touch on, specifically in the time-strapped area, which is to say the moment that 72-hour breach notification came down the pipe, it required all of us, credit unions, vendor-supported credit unions, similar organizations stuck with this compliance, to really have to figure out what is the reportability, what is the materiality of these breaches that are falling into my environment if I do get breached. And what is the scope of these threats? Because that 72-hour timeline puts that specific counter on you whenever something happens. And how do you know when something actually has happened and when it's relevant to report? In most cases, we don't see large IT teams inside of credit unions. And that's, of course, an SMB talking about, from my point of view, organizations with under 1,000 employees don't tend to have really big IT teams that are deploying a bunch of people to do it. And even if you do, it tends to just involve a lot of burnout. Being on call 24/7 is not fun. I was on call for about 15 years straight. I don't recommend it. It is one of those things that just burns people out, and it's something that we continue to see more of as there's more expectation for response. And for compliance security, I'm going to pass it over to Jim to chat a little about what he's seeing in the market.
Sure. I mean, those are two very important and related terms, but there's always some confusion about the difference between the two. And I've always tried to take a pretty simplistic view. So security are those processes and technology, along with people, that you put into place in order to attack against an identified risk. So this is why risk management, risk assessment and risk management is at the heart of all of this. And risk may vary from one credit union to another, from one organization to another. So you identify your risks, then your security program comes into place to mitigate those risks with specific controls, specific technologies. Compliance comes in kind of off of the side, and that says, yeah, I'm glad you're doing those things, but I really need a third party to kind of come in and assess you and what you're doing against maybe some standard or another. There are many out there. And because I'd really like to hear from that third party that you're okay. That's compliance.
Yeah, for sure. And the joy of compliance and dealing with auditors, I think is just spread across all of us in the industry at this point, which is no slight against auditors, for those of you who are listening to this and watching this. But it's one of those areas that the brain switch between the two, compliance and
Yes.
security, can be a really interesting and difficult thing at times as well, especially in smaller teams that have to do both of the things at once.
And certainly credit unions are no strangers to auditors. It's
Right.
just this is another whole group of auditors that are interested in their security program.
Yes, very much so. And Jim, I'm interested. Are you seeing more SOC 2 in the credit union space as well then?
Yes, SOC 2 is kind of a North America centric security compliance standard. And so that's certainly the dominant one there. For customers and companies that deal internationally, then certainly ISO 27001 is a big one. But yeah, for North America businesses, certainly SOC 2 is by far the leader.
That makes a lot of sense. Right. Well, we're gonna start moving on. We have a lot of different stuff to touch on today. And again, as Zoe had said, please put in any questions and we'll get to them as they come in. So, as we look across the industry, I think a lot of us can feel that there's a need for, or I should say, a desire for people to go faster, for there to be more compliance, for there to be more security, due to the fact that there are more threats. And when you continuously pile up this situation of, well, there needs to be more, how can we do more? It gets even harder in organizations, which is not unique to any specific vertical, that have legacy and older systems. It is just an inevitability of organizations that have been around for a while. If you are a Fortune 500 company, you have some benefit of having a ton of money. But as Jim well knows, big organizations have a whole lot of legacy stuff floating around that causes issues for them. It's not as if we turn on the news and see only people being breached are small organizations. This is just one of those things that you have this continuous friction drive that lives within the security and compliance world that makes it harder as things get more complex and you have to do more and go faster. And similarly, to have that 24/7 team, to get to that tight turnaround and reporting for the 72-hour breach notification. So, across NCUA, if you're in the state of New York, really anyone who's starting to have these requirements, you have these issues with potential consequences for failing to comply, but you aren't put in a position where you can be successful necessarily. And when we aren't really driving people to being successful with organizations or tooling or partnerships to make them work, it gets harder for people like yourselves to really drive to success inside of these areas. Another big thing that we see that is just kind of happening broadly across the market, and it's been happening for I don't know how long. How many years, Jim, have you heard that there's a shortage of skills in the industry?
20.
Yeah, forever. Since we started using cybersecurity, we're like, oh, we don't have enough people for this. We should probably get some more of those people. And if we've learned anything so far, it's that there will always be a cybersecurity skills shortage. There is no situation where either there will be enough cybersecurity people to do the work, or there's enough budget to bring the cybersecurity people to bear to do that work. Most organizations, for good reason, their businesses are not applying a lot of their budget specifically to cybersecurity. They're applying it to IT, they're applying it to IT operations. And you run into this situation broadly across the security market that there is not technology and there are not partners that are really great at partnering with people that are focused more on IT and compliance and not necessarily on cybersecurity. It's really important that you have to balance those needs for business priorities. And from the cybersecurity compliance side, that's always tough because we want to just solve the problems. But the business, especially in the case of credit unions, where you're going to run that margin, you want to make sure you are not burning too much money. It can get hard to bring people to bear to solve that skills shortage. And of course, when you get into that implementing and maintaining what you have in your environment, you have to keep working on it. I'm sure Jim has seen this yearly cycle that has to happen. And
Right.
you, Jim, I'd be interested kind of like, how do you see people deal with that? Oh, I have to do this again this year. Like I've always heard the second year of SOC 2 is the hardest because you actually have to prove what you said you did.
That's exactly right. It's almost like the first year, you're so excited, you're like climbing a hill, right? And you get to the top of the hill and you think, yes, we're done. We'll never have to do this again. I'm
Yeah.
done the race. I finished the race. And then
Yeah.
you realize there's another hill the same size that you still have to climb, which is
Yep.
called year two. Now, what happens at that point, because many times to get to that year one, you've sort of borrowed people internally in order to get this project done. So what we see is very often that's the pivot point where the companies start to think about outsourcing some or all of the compliance program, not the security program necessarily, but the compliance program.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's an area that, there's cost with that, right? Like to your
Right.
point, you borrowed humans for that first year, you have the
Yeah.
second year. And if you aren't getting that additional budget, if you aren't having the ability to scale monetarily within that environment, you get to that second year of proving performance, and it is a bummer. We'll put it that way. It is
Exactly. And what happens is compliance people are expensive and they're difficult to retain. And so we actually had a customer with a compliance person left in the middle of the audit.
Mm, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
I don't want that to happen when I am doing my compliance, that's for sure. And looking across, and I like to look at kind of historically, at least over the last 10, 15 years, where we've changed. And it's really interesting. You go back 10, 15, 20 years, there was a lot less of an expectation of breach. The breach expectation 15 years ago was like, oh, I might get hit with Emotet. They might steal some of my banking data. It might be an annoying bummer. We're going to have to go through notifications, but it'll be okay. And really what we've seen is this continuous ramp up of, am I going to be targeted? Is what I'm exposing going to be leveraged? And what other are the ways that are going to get attacked? Is my organization going to get attacked? Like business email compromise, leveraging your organization to take money out of your organization through APAR, as well as ransomware. And some of that is protected through cyber insurance, and we can see people continuing to search for it more. But cyber insurance doesn't solve the inherent problem. It doesn't solve that there are new attack vectors. It doesn't solve that there are those new techniques. And most importantly, it doesn't solve what is kind of driving that all, especially in regard to this conversation, which is the NCUA compliance, the organizations at hand, and then not necessarily having the wherewithal and people inside to make that work. And Jim, on your side, how do you kind of see that evolving over this last 10 years from a compliance and application side to really kind of drive those people to success? Because that seems like it only gets harder.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Matt. And, to what you were saying earlier, 10 years ago, it was more, a cyber incident was more about an inconvenience, a temporary inconvenience or that type of thing. Whereas today, it's much more about a potentially business ending event. And so what we've seen, again, on the compliance side, is much more of an emphasis on business continuity and disaster recovery, tabletop exercises, incident detection and response, tabletop exercises, because this is no longer a nuisance. It is a potential, and that's why it's now being discussed at the board of directors level, because it's the board of directors that's worried about a company's viability. And that is truly what the nature of today's incidents, ransomware incidents, et cetera. We're talking about the viability of these companies.
Yes, 100% spot on. And especially with the joy of the new CrowdStrike issue, we are now introducing these concepts of like fourth party impact. Like, what if you get taken down because of a party that you just happened to
You
purchase?
did nothing wrong.
Yep,
Exactly right.
there was
Yeah.
nothing you could have done. And
Yeah.
I was just having a conversation with a cyber insurer this week, and now they're looking at, all right, do we need to start doing downtime insurance? Do we need to start looking at how we can really kind of solve that? Because Jim, you and I were talking about like, what's your recovery point objective when you really want to be recovered? And in situations where you don't have control, it gets a lot harder to really know when you'll land there. All right, so I'm gonna take over for a few slides and kind of talk about how Blumira looks at what we see from credit unions from a data perspective. And I like to talk about these because I don't think this is information that we often talk about broadly as a community, as a security community. Like, what do industries tend to send? What do they see? And what happens to these industries specifically? And we'll talk about credit unions. Generally speaking, we are almost always going to see Microsoft 365, SentinelOne, Duo, Umbrella, and Mimecast. And I like to call it Mimecast because Mimecast was only added because of credit unions leveraging it and hating how much noise it made. And it's a perfect example for, you know, threat detection and leveraging tooling that makes it easier for you. I'm not talking about Blumira specifically. Use anything you want that works great for you, but find tools that make your other tools palatable, especially if they're in place and functioning. You want to be able to get functionality out of them. And broadly, you know, this is a good set of tooling to keep people secure, but it's important to keep in mind, kind of to Jim's point that we were just talking about, it's no longer just an annoyance if you get breached. It's really more, what of these tools that I'm leveraging will make it so my company is still viable if there is an attack. So here's what we see really. This is over the last year. This is the group from this was about 210 credit unions. And this is what we're seeing from a threats and suspects perspective inside of Blumira. And I like to call this out because a lot of these are threats and suspects that could have been a risk, but in many cases were not necessarily causing a breach, which is to say, we see heavy TeamViewer usage across the credit union space because there's a need to be able to connect to machines that are ad hoc across branches. It is just a necessity across this environment. Similar batch script execution from tends to be legacy processes to executing batch scripts inside of these environments, as well as the clear text password we see across a few different areas in credit unions. And a lot of these I attribute to processes that are aged and likely have not yet been brought up to newer standards, which is to say, and Jim, I'm sure you see this all the time, when you have a conversation with people about password managers, like how does that tend to go? How do you position that from a compliance and risk perspective? Because that's really the combating force in these clear type. This is your Excel passwords, your marketing team's got a thing of passwords. How have you seen moving people away from that work?
It really starts with policy, and it
Yep.
starts with buy-in from senior most management. And it is the development of a security first culture. And
Yep.
You know, it sort of goes back to the last comment I made that literally the whole business is at risk. Everyone's paycheck is at risk. If you can't get behind that and put up with a little inconvenience, then you probably need to go find someplace else to work. That's really what the conversation comes down to.
Yes, I love the way you put that. Totally agree. It is, you got to reduce that risk somehow, and you can't accept the risk and just burn it all down for it.
And we all know, it's been well documented in many, many studies, that people are the weakest link.
Yes. Yes. Think about your marketer. They open an email, they open a file, they get shelled, they have a whole file with all their passwords on their system. This is a problem that kind of grows across that environment. Yes, definitely.
Or, you know, similarly, Matt, how many people know that multi-factor authentication makes such a huge difference, but they find it inconvenience and, you know, they disable it. You know, they shouldn't be able to, but they do. And that's the one account that gets compromised, et cetera. It's just bad corporate citizenship.
It is, yes. And this is exactly what we saw with Snowflake. The breach earlier this year with Snowflake, they did not require 2FA on their demo accounts, which then got leveraged for full accounts, which then were breached with cred stuffing.
Yep.
It is a common problem at this point. MFA is very, very important. The amount of times I get the request of, can we just, so Blumira requires 2FA on our product.
Yeah, we do too.
Yeah, and we often get the request of, could you just like make it so we can turn that off? And my response is always, no, we cannot. It
Well,
is
how many times have you heard the story that, well, everybody's in the company is okay with it, but the CEO, really won't buy into it. Well, and the CEO has 5 different devices, and who do you think the bad guys are going after? Of course,
exactly.
it's the
Yeah.
CEO.
I have
And
no doubt.
he or she is the one person that doesn't have MFA enabled.
Yes, yes. I have no doubt that in at Trava there are people in your company getting fake text messages from you as well, saying that you would
All
like
the time. Yeah.
credits. Yeah, it is just how it is.
We put it as part of our new employee onboarding
Yeah.
because it's been within a week of them announcing on LinkedIn that they're now working for Trava Security, bam, they get something from me,
Yep.
supposedly.
It is. There are more criminals making more money than there are, generally speaking, people in the cybersecurity industry at this point. It
Correct.
just how it is. Especially
Correct.
from a people perspective, maybe not from a company revenue
Right.
perspective. And the last one I want to touch on just on here, advanced IP scanner. This is one of the ones that's really interesting to me. This is something we see broadly more in the MSP side than we see anywhere else, but really more to drive like, well, how do I get quick visibility into my environment? I'll just go download this tool that I know works. And this is something that we like to touch on because this is what ransomware operators use as well to identify what's happening in your environment. It's also a often tainted binary, which I'm going to touch on in a second as well. The next area, which is really kind of descriptive and showing how credit unions touch the compliance world. And what we see in Blumira is a lot of driving compliance through risk and operational alerting, which is to say, if you can prove that you worked every Windows account lockout, you can prove to your auditor that you put a lot of work into making sure that you did strong work to ensure that, you checked it, you validated it, you unlocked this account, they are okay. A lot of this is really more around how do you drive your organization? Do you use conditional access policies to block logins? Do you allow people to authenticate from outside the US? How are people consenting to applications being granted in your environment? Because these are the areas where you start to expose data out of your 365 environment, maybe not intentionally. Users love to add applications randomly to your 365 environments in terrifying ways. And it's important to really kind of drive through that and be able to see what's happening. The last thing that I like to touch on this slide is the one at the bottom here, outbound connection. This is one of those things that I feel like has changed over the last 10, 20 years, where we went really heavy for a while and like, how do we monitor the network? How do we make sure that we're not sending big things out and pulling big things in? And how's this kind of fitting together? And we still see regularly people pushing data out of environments, being able to detect that kind of thing through just firewall and endpoint data because it's important to know when these things are happening. And like the last live example I have at the top of my head, we had a user that was connecting out to their own RDP server and then copy and pasting files via RDP out to the internet. Like these are the things that you want to be able to see. Like how are people leveraging that network?
Hey, Matt, real quick on
No,
that.
please, Jim.
I just want to talk about a trend that really exacerbated that situation. So pre-pandemic, when most of us were going into an office, right? And we were sitting at our desks or in our cubes or whatever, using our laptops. All right, we were behind, in most cases, behind a corporate firewall. So, we were in a protected space, right? And those firewalls are very strong. They protected a lot of bad stuff from getting in, right? Pandemic hits, everybody goes home. Where's the perimeter of the network now? It's no longer the corporate firewall. It's Matt's home internet router. It's Jim's home internet router. And we're using our corporate laptops, but the perimeter of the corporate network is now more or less unprotected out in the wild. So that's when things, and technology was kind of slow to catch up with that, right? Not everybody was on VPNs all the time, et cetera. So, it's funny how societal changes can be suddenly introduced in a business context, and all of a sudden it becomes a cybersecurity issue.
Very much so. Yeah. Thank you for calling out COVID. COVID changed so much in the cybersecurity industry.
Absolutely.
You know, even just pre-COVID, we were still at pretty good, like if you have a hard shell, it's probably
Right.
okay.
Right.
But there are no more hard shells in the grand scheme of it all.
Nope.
You run into these issues to your point of VPNs. Like even if you have a VPN, are you split tunneling that VPN? How are you applying that?
Bingo. Yeah.
Like you get into these situations where you're exposing risk not intentionally. And if you
Mhm.
are not deploying EDRs, collecting an insane amount of data and saying like, all right, what exactly is this machine doing or what are other machines doing close to it? You run into this kind of unseen risk that's really
Right.
hard to quash, just generally speaking. It is, yeah, COVID was wild for that. That's for sure. Among other things, but definitely for that. So I'd like to end on this as kind of like what we see in the industry. And this was a we'll call it a near miss breach against a credit union. And I like to talk about it from the standpoint of it being related to some of the detections we just talked about, but also kind of how different technologies flow across an attack when they occur. So in this case, this was a user that was searching for advanced IP scanner. They wanted to check what was going on their network. So they just search for advanced IP scanner and click the first thing on the list. However, the first thing on that list was a malvertising link with a fake website for advanced IP scanner. Once they had downloaded it, they clicked it, they ran it, and it started executing droppers to put a foothold into that environment. Where we are from a Blumira perspective is then looking at it from the standpoint of our EDR data. So Sentinel-1 missed it on the foothold, which is not a huge surprise. Like it's a net new foothold. They likely have never seen it before. It's likely performing similar-ish behaviors. And in this case, it was dropping files in a fairly hard to tell way. When that user or attacker then attempted to pivot to the DC, Blumira was able to detect it through the command shell being spawned on that DC because of our data that we pull in. Then the attacker then moved on to, all right, we're going to start staging these files down into the C2. We're going to start making sure we have full beachhead connection into that DC. As they then started to move even further onto the third host, the NGAV started to detect their droppers. So they were able, about a day and a half later, Sentinel-1 then was able to pick it up, see what was happening, and start cleaning up what had occurred, but they had already started resolution at that point, so they were able to kind of do the same thing at the same time. Incident was declared right when Sentinel-1 was starting to pick it up, and then containment proceeded, and then we removed the attacker from the environment with support of the organization and the Blumira SOC team. And this is one of those areas, like this is just a common breach pattern at this point. This is not unique. Malvertising is a very common way to drive malware into your IT organization. Think about those that use PuTTY. Think about those that use MobaXterm. It is very easy to set up malvertising watering hole sites to pull those people in. They run a binary. And if it's a net new attack, most NGAVs, so your baseline Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike, are going to miss it generally because they haven't seen the signature before. It's important to get that EDR level information to be able to see really what is happening in my environment. What's the full logbook of what's happening in my environment to see that level of kind of risk, be able to stop it ahead of time, isolate it ahead of time, or at least start to get into it so you can remove the attacker from the environment before you get ransomed. It is an inevitability at this point in our experience that ransom comes if there is a breach. It may not be the group that initially does it, but they will broker and sell access to your environment. It is a very incestuous group of criminals that tend to push this kind of thing. And in our experience, ransomware timelines are anywhere from 1 hour to 30 days. So you have this really wide swath of risk that you have to approach. And if you go back and look at these, there are a number of detections in here that flow within this. Batch script execution, advanced IP scanner. How are they approaching that? So it's important to have, Blumira or not, doesn't really matter. It's important to have strong detection, strong ability to pull in that data and be able to say, all right, not just NGAV detection. I want to be able to know if someone does something through WMI, because that is a clear risk that we often see from attackers. So we're going to move on to the next kind of like, how do we solve problems? So how do we kind of move through our strategic area and start to really kind of make things work? And we're going to start with Jim. Kind of, what is the strategic level of risk management? How do you see that, Jim? How do you see it being applied across the environment? And how can we start to solve these problems?
Well, Matt, you know how much I like to ad lib, and you mentioned the word watering hole attack.
Mm,
So I have to talk about that for a second,
sure.
because
Yeah, go
when I
for
was
it.
with the FBI, I investigated a watering hole attack that took down a bank and
Mm,
actually was able to get funds out of it. And it was completely innocent. So this is a good example of good people doing nothing wrong can
yep.
still enable horrible things. So there was a bank employee who went to the local local newspapers, TV stations,
Mm,
website to check the weather. Unbeknownst to them, that local TV station's website had been compromised and had malicious advertising on it. That's the waterhole attack.
yep.
Because of that, that malware was downloaded onto the bank's computers, and as we say, the rest is history. But it was, a good employee doing nothing wrong, and those were the consequences. That's a watering hole attack, right there. So what do we
Yeah.
do about it? At the highest level, what's the first step? That's what we always try to talk about, is what's the right approach to this. And it sort of doesn't matter about what technology you buy or whatever. What's the process look like? So we're only talking process here. And the first step in the process is clearly understand your risks, because
Yep.
the context is that no two companies are alike. No two credit unions are alike. Yes, they may have some common risk, but they may have some unique risks as well. So just simply templatizing and putting in the same exact technology that some other credit union about put in is not necessarily the right solution for you. So everybody needs their own baseline cyber risk assessment. And the example I sometimes give is, if the check engine light in your car goes on, you pull into the local auto parts store, you're not just going to grab a shopping cart and randomly go up and down the aisle and start throwing technology in and thinks that's going to fix it. No, you need that diagnosis. You need that assessment that says, well, what's wrong? What am I trying to fix? It's the
Yep.
same thing here. All right. All of our, believe me, from a security standpoint, all of our check engine lights are on. The
Yes.
question is, what's the underlying problem? You can only figure that out with your own baseline cyber risk assessment. What comes out of that is something that we call a risk register. And again, going back to compliance, if you're going to pass a SOC 2 or an ISO audit, one of the first things the auditor is going to ask for is, where's your annual risk assessment?
Yep.
Show me your risk register and show me your risk mitigation roadmap. Now, I've got slides of what that looks like in Trava later on. I'll show you, but the point is, you have to have that prioritized list of risks that senior most management is reviewing on whatever basis the board meets anyway, quarterly or whatever. And this is fairly new, because boards have examined risk on an ongoing basis, but it's been financial risk, brand reputation risk, competitive risk, etc. The idea that boards need to talk about cyber risk is a fairly new concept. Many laws and regulations, again, going back to compliance, are now saying boards must review this on a quarterly basis, or boards must have a board member who is qualified, in the field of cyber risk management, et cetera. Now, clearly, when we get down to the solutions, as Matt has alluded to, if you're not watching your stuff 24/7, it's like game over. That's just table stakes right there. As we said before, SOC 2 is the most common standard for this. Now, SOC 2 has controls. You ought to be doing something in this area. You ought to be doing something in this area. You ought to be doing something in this area. SOC 2 doesn't say buy this product or buy that product. It says you need to do this thing somehow. Show me your evidence that you're doing it. I think I go in on another slide into some of the intricacies of SOC 2 and nuances and the SOC 2 type 1 and all that kind of thing.
It's actually perfect timing, Jim. We did get a question in asking the difference between SOC 2 Type 1 and SOC 2 Type 2. So I think you're
Yeah.
about to cover that here. That'll be perfect.
I love that. Yeah. So let me talk about that. So SOC 2, it's multifaceted in that most people think it's just the security controls, which are called the common criteria. And that's true. But you can also get SOC 2, it's going to get confusing. You can also add on, so everybody has to start with the security common criteria, but then you can add on and get like an additional, think of it as a rider certification in confidentiality, availability, processing integrity, and privacy, okay? But let's just for now assume we're only concerned with the security ones. There are 2 steps to it. Those 2 steps are called types. So SOC 2 Type 1 says you've got everything properly designed and everything implemented. And think of that as your initial gateway. So the external auditors come in and they go down through all your evidence and they say, yes, all of these, everything's in place. You got the proper processes in place. All the technology looks good. It's almost like you get a green light, because what SOC 2 Type 2 says is, and you've shown evidence over a period of time that you decide, can be as little as 3 months, the longest is usually 12 months, and they'll come back for that Type 2 and look through that with a fine-tooth comb, look through that 3 months to 12 months worth of evidence and say, not only was it properly designed and implemented, which we said in Type 1, but also continuously properly implemented, monitored, managed, evidence collected, etc. And then you get your Type 2.
Yes, back to what we were just talking about or at the beginning of, you have performance is the hard part. Continuing to show that you've continued to do what you said you were going to do. That is that, like, it doesn't seem like it should be the hard part, but it's by far the hardest part of Type 2.
Getting the tool installed, purchased and installed is the easy part. That gets you to Type 1. That's right. Yeah, we can go on to the next slide.
All right. Oop. Wrong place. All right. So risk management, at a tactical level so Jim and I we're like on different sides of the coin that you need to have either way to enter the park. We'll go with that as the analogy, sure. When we look at this tactically, it is really, you have to have the compliance side organized, you have the risk assessment side organized, you have to know what you're protecting. Otherwise, it's hard to know what you're protecting, for lack of a better way to put that. And sometimes there is this, we'll say, expectation that if you have more cybersecurity tools, you will be more protected. We've seen this in a number of polls, but generally speaking, that's not really the expectation. And similarly, like you just heard Jim talking about, it's not really what SOC 2 expects either. Just buying a bunch of tools doesn't mean anything. You can design stuff and have tools, but how are you using those tools? How are you using them to perform that security need, that control in your environment? So think about those tools whenever you're sitting down, you're like, I'm exhausted. I have all these things to work on. Do you need them? Are they actually driving success in your organization? Are you able to leverage them in a way that makes you more secure? Or is it something you purchase and you're now in this sunk cost situation with it? Think about what is best for your organization when you go through those risk assessments. And most importantly, when you move into the purchasing decision on the technical side, so the products you're buying to solve that situation, think about what's most important to you for your team. So when we look across this, it's important to have the ability to have a lot of this be automated. We've seen this trap. Well, I think it's been a trap for about 20 years in this industry of, well, we have this really complex thing, you figure it out. And that is a continuous problem in the IT and cybersecurity industry of there's not enough time for people to figure things out, but people in this industry like to figure things out. So when you have that opening, that time ends up getting kind of borrowed from other areas to figure something out. And you run back into that situation of, well, this isn't really working for my team. It just technically does work. So think about what really works for your team to make you successful, to solve that risk management, risk assessment stuff that you just worked on. Because otherwise you just run into the same problem again looking forward. Going back to what Jim said before, compliance doesn't equal security necessarily. You really have to make sure you are leveraging those tools and following what you said on the compliance side and driving that to where an area that you can at to that level of success. And this is a rare thing in the industry, but user-friendly security platforms and tooling is what 98% of organizations should be leveraging or looking for at this point. There is a deep desire, I understand why, to look at the biggest, most important, fancy thing in the world. We'll call out Splunk as a general example and
Yeah.
say, look at all the great things it can do. It's so big, it's so powerful, it's been around for 20 years, it can do all this stuff. Most people don't have a big enough team to make it work. It's not user friendly, and it's not really positioned in a way for IT people to leverage it. And look across your team, look at the person sitting in the same office as you, look across your organization. If there are not a team of engineers and security people, there are only so many tools that will fit within what you need to do to drive to success for the organization without you just burning yourself out. That's not to say you can't make it work, but it's going to be not fun to make it work, generally speaking. And you're going to take that time from somewhere else. Where we often see that, and I'm sure, Jim, yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts here. We often see time being borrowed from vulnerability management and put into other areas. And for you, Jim, where do you see vulnerability management kind of falling into that environment, vulnerability asset management, and kind of just like, how do you apply that tactical to that?
Well, you said something really important right at the end, vulnerability management and asset management. And that's sort of where you started on this slide was asset inventory, asset control. You can, the phrase is you cannot protect what you don't know about.
Yes.
And, you know, we've seen customers where it was the demo server that everybody had forgotten about that popped. It was the Amazon S3 bucket that they thought they'd shut down 2 years ago that it turned out wasn't shut down. So it's almost like don't spend a dime on a tool until you have some type of technology, processes, et cetera, to know exactly what you have for assets at any point in time. And, you know, if it changes in an instant, where's that change come up? If a new device comes online, if a device goes offline, you have to know about your assets because you can't protect what you don't know about. And you made another good point, Matt, that I wanted to just point out again. You said just because you're compliant doesn't mean you're secure. All right. Two good examples. Target and Home Depot were both SOC 2 certified when they got terribly popped.
Yeah, and kind of going back to we were talking about COVID and remote work. Like you look at the LastPass breach, which started with a Plex server at that person's machine, which then resulted in them breaching the actual machine that they had and then breaching an S3 bucket.
Exactly.
And like you have this chain, and it's important to be able to see across that chain because there will always be holes somewhere. But it's important to be able to get to those assets, know your assets, have visibility into those assets, and partner with vendors that are really going to help you make those assets stronger, more secure, have comprehensive security brought to you, and that's made for you. Because most things in this industry are not made for the size of most credit unions, the size of most businesses in the country as a whole. It's just
one more quick FBI story.
Sure.
One of the things that was sort of a light bulb moment for me was cyber criminals are no different than any other criminals. They're basically lazy and they're going to take the path of least resistance. So whereas a burglar type criminal, they're going to walk down the street, they're going to try every doorknob. If one's unlocked, that's the one they're not going to break glass in every store, right? They're going to look for the unlocked door. Cyber criminals are the same way. They're going to look for that one system with that one unlocked back door. Now it's probably an asset that somebody forgot about, to our earlier point.
Yes. Yes, so it is often oh yeah, that thing. Yeah, that forgot about that thing. And that's just, you know, it goes back to the complexity of managing large networks, large modern networks, large modern organizations and infrastructure. You grow over time, you change over time. It is hard to evolve your team, which is often not big, with what changes there as well.
And people are constantly on the go. They're not in the office. They're working remotely. They're not always home, et cetera.
Yeah. And even going back to the cybersecurity skill shortage, right? Like more than likely you don't have people in the seat who put 10 years into cybersecurity.
Right.
They're probably in IT, which is great. IT is what's going to drive cybersecurity moving forward because there are not enough cybersecurity people. There just are not. And I don't expect there ever will be.
There are people that feel like it's one field. Interestingly enough, we have a vCISO who was a colonel in the Air Force, and his job was CIO/CISO. In the military, it's not two jobs; it's one job.
Yeah, I would definitely put them much closer these days. It is, like when we run IT, we run it as a full ITsec team here internally at Blumira, primarily for that exact reason. You really have to know what each hand is doing to be able to get to the same place. And you see that being a problem at large organizations that have these big teams. They're trying to pull it all together, and it can be difficult. It's just humans are not great at communicating, especially remotely. We are not great at it. We're better in person. And the last thing I want to touch on here from a technical perspective, find partners that are honest with you. That's the hard part, and knowledgeable, and they will have support for you. One of the areas that I like to touch on is be careful to fall in the dedication trap without that dedication being able to be a fit for you. There are a lot of people in the security industry to solve that security shortage problem will say, well, we have a dedicated team. Dedicated teams don't mean anything if they're dedicated to 100 different organizations and you're expecting that to work. Think about what you need. What's your day-to-day expectation from that platform or from that product? And make sure that your team will get what they need and the way that they can respond, and not just an open-ended promise that we swear will be able to help you. It's important to dig into some of these organizations because security is a big, weird industry at this point. So it's important to really kind of focus on what these people are doing. So we have 13 minutes left. So we're going to chat about partnering with Trava and Blumira. And first up is Trava.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'll try to be brief.
Well, no, you're good.
This is, I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically what we're saying is we have a structured approach to this, and that's kind of been our secret. It's the reason that we've been able to automate a lot of this and do this cost effectively, that we can scale, quite reasonably. And so we've broken it out into these 4 major sections. So, the first section is you need some kind of governance, risk management, compliance platform. We have new partners with a company named SecureFrame. That's going to keep all your evidence, going to keep all your policies, it's going to keep all your processes, and that's where you store your evidence. It's going to have little dials that say you're 90% there, you're missing this piece of evidence, someone didn't put their screenshot in last quarter. It's so great because in the old days, we used to have to do all that by hand. And now these platforms just do all that kind of compliance busy work, I'll call it, for you. As I mentioned before, you have to get that initial risk assessment done because that's where you get your risk register, risk mitigation roadmap. Then you get to work on that. You put together your road mapping, you implement the tools that you need, you buy Blumira, etc. Once you feel like you're all set, then what we do, because most of our customers aren't big enough to have their own internal audit team, so we do an internal audit, which is required for whether it's SOC 2 or ISO. The external auditors won't engage until you can give them your internal audit report to show you've been through all of your evidence with a fine-tooth comb, and you're kind of asserting to them that you're ready to be externally audited. So you get that external audit done. And then the irony is, it's kind of what Matt was saying before. Don't even read them, but look how many things are in the last 2 columns as opposed to the first 2 columns, right? Yep. So the first 2 columns gets you that first certificate, then the fun begins.
Yes. Fun. I don't know if I described it as fun, but it is kind of.
Yeah. So I mentioned terms like risk register and risk mitigation roadmap. You may have seen them before, you may have never have seen them before, but what happens is based on the current state of your environment. So we've asked, depending on which framework we go against, it may be 50 questions, it may be 72 questions, et cetera. Are you doing this? To what extent? Are you doing that? To what extent? We put that together. We say, well, based on all your answers, here are the highest level risks that you have to deal with. And so, it's based on likelihood and impact that gives you your total risk score, et cetera. And then we just show you here, within that risk register, you can assign people, you can say what the impact would be, et cetera. You can actually adjust the impact again to your company based on the differences there. I think the next slide is the mitigation roadmap. No, what happens here is, well, where'd that risk come from, Jim? And so what happens here is, okay, well, here with the scores that you got on your controls based on the answers to these questions. And these are kind of related to Blumira, which is why I chose them. So, you know, you've got a fairly high risk score, fairly low maturity score on your network monitoring and defense. That's why we said you have a higher risk of inability to respond to security incidents. So control maturity or immaturity in this case leads to risks. The risk is what you need to mitigate. You have to be able to show your auditors that you have a plan to mitigate this.
Yes, very much so.
And then this is just, you know, that particular one, you know, well, what question was it? How'd you answer it? And then we go into, well, what's the threat, you know, really, and what should we do about it?
Yeah, great.
And then this is just a little bit of a review. So as I said, how do you go for SOC 2 compliance? You have to start with a risk assessment, then you develop your policies and procedures. There's always employee training involved. If you don't have a security awareness program in place, you really should. You know, it doesn't have to be oppressive is the word that comes to mind.
Good word.
The way we do it is we do, it's required 15 minutes a month, every month. We don't make people sit through 2 hours of slides or something like that. And yeah, it just becomes a habit. First every month, everybody gets an email, please do security awareness training, etc. Obviously, you need strong technical controls. As I alluded to before, incident response and business continuity and disaster recovery are really big these days. So there's a lot, again, you need to have a plan in place, but more importantly, you have to exercise that plan. And you have to say, well, it didn't work as we thought, because we thought we were going to get from here and be able to establish this new user ID over there. But if this system's down in the middle, we're not going to be able to get there. That's the beauty of having these tabletop exercises.
100%.
Third-party risk management is a big deal, especially for credit unions, because as you alluded to it at the start, you know, very few credit unions have their own software that they're developing and dependent on. It's all third party, right? And so this is not unique to credit unions. Third-party risk management, it's sometimes called supply chain risk management. This is a big trend, partly because of, look at all the last major breaches, like there was Kaseya, and you know, and now there was Checkpoint, et cetera. It's totally out of your control. You've been compromised. And then finally, obviously, you have to get the audit with an independent audit. And just to be clear, Trava is a consultant, a compliance advisor. We can't be external auditors. So, but we have external audit partners, obviously, and we can help do this.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you, Jim. And yes, anyone who's looking for SOC 2 support, definitely reach out to Trava. They will very much help you out in getting that organized, as well as any other compliance needs. I think this one is mine, so I'll take this one. Thank you, Jim. And so kind of how we look at, the royal we, look at, you know, how do you elevate the security and compliance efficiency for credit unions? And I think a lot of it comes around, you know, what is coming down the pipe? What is a new compliance requirement? How do I need to really kind of broaden my security posture in a way that I actually can do that and simplify my compliance management with tools like Trava, while making sure that there's some amount of peace of mind. And over on the right, these are all the controls that Blumira supports across the SOC 2 world. And, you know, we look at this from the standpoint of compliance is a framework for you to solve those security issues in your environment. We want to make sure that you can solve those problems in a way that involves no effort from you. They're really, you know, for credit unions especially, and for a lot of companies in the SMB or small enterprise space, having to go through each of these controls and try to figure it out with a fine-tooth comb as to how exactly they match it is difficult, just because there are more than a few controls associated with all of these compliance regimes. So finding partners like Blumira, Trava, other ones that can help you solve these controls and boil them down into something that you can actually take a bite out of really helps solve that problem for you, especially when it comes to how big your team is, how much budget you have to bear, and what you're kind of running at across that time as well. And at Blumira, we really work as an extension of your team. I'm sure Trava works similarly, where you are kind of getting that SecOps team to support you. You're getting the support analyst to really kind of drive you to success, and that dedicated solutions architect to help you say, all right, what do you look like from the outside? What's happening internally? Do you have a new compliance area that you need to focus on? And how can we help you get there or get better and grow your maturity over time? And of course, Blumira also has our own detection engineering team that is fully automated across the platform. Not, well, partially because we love security, but really more because we want to drive that to success for people without them having to really think about it. The hardest part about detection at scale with a SIM is being able to know what to deploy, when to deploy it, and how to make sure that detection is going to be valid. And one of the most important parts of Blumira is ensuring that you can get any information into Blumira that's relevant and make sure that you can find threats and risks that are relevant to you when they are coming across the pipe as well. And in general, we kind of, I've touched on this a few times, and I'm going to touch on it just broadly. And anytime you see me talk, I'll always touch on it. It's important for cybersecurity and compliance, and we're starting to see this in the market, to start making tools that make things easier for people. It is really just kind of what we've done for 20 years to produce tooling that can be leveraged, but is not easy to leverage in a way that is successful. So really kind of saying, how do we take that manual security task? Because 20 years ago, PCI was just saying, well, just look at your logs manually, like just look at them every day, and then you can meet compliance. That doesn't work. It didn't work then. It doesn't work now. So how do we get to that faster time to security? Blumira really supports that through being the effective detection side and ensuring that you can accelerate that breach prevention through automated response and the team that's behind it. And in general, we are an all-in-one platform, data platform that's based around a SIM. I will always say this, but I am biased because I am the founder. SIM and data platforms are the central point for a lot of your security tooling. Yes, can you log into a random thing and look at it? You can. But you're better off getting that full view broadly across your environment, enhancing your ability to get insights out of your environment, because there's always going to be something interesting for you to see. That moment that you get that clear text password alert, you now know I need to work on process and policy for password managers. I need to figure out where I have exposure. It gives you that ability to kind of move forward through that environment. And in general, if you're interested, Blumira is free to try. So by all means, please check out blumira.com/free, and I will let Jim wrap up on Trava.
And same thing with Trava. I've been stressing all throughout the webinar today that you have to start with a risk assessment, and we offer one for free.
Perfect. Free's the best, isn't it?
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was incredibly educational. Thank you to our attendees for joining today. We are coming up close on the end of the hour, so I do want to make mention that when the session ends, please, if you have a moment to fill out the post-webinar survey, let us know. We want to make sure that this program continues to be as helpful for you and targeted on what you're caring about and thinking about as possible. I want to thank our speakers, and I want to try and sneak a question in here, Matt, that we got a while ago about the role that third-party vendors play in a material data breach, and how can you kind of mitigate that risk?
Yeah, so they tend to take two different roles. One, they cause the breach, which hopefully doesn't happen, or so in the case of like Kaseya, to Jim's point, where you have a supply chain that's resulting in third-party breaches. The other side of it is working with security vendors like Blumira and other ones to say, when am I materially breached? That is a question that we hear a lot more lately of they've asked me to say I've been materially breached. How do I know if I've been materially breached across that environment? And the thing that we have seen work the best is to really partner with two sides. You know your environment better than anyone. There's no one in this world that knows your environment better than you. I don't care if you sign up with an MDR. I don't care if you sign up with the best MDR company in the world. They still don't know your environment as well as you do. So it's important for those situations to become a team partnership between your security vendors that are enhancing that data, evaluating that data, performing that response, to work with your team to say, what hasn't been impacted? What is happening in this environment? What is the splash of this potential attack? And what could happen moving forward and moving quickly into containment? And you can make things a lot easier for yourself by having things like, host isolation, making sure that these are automated, ensuring that you know what's happening in your environment. But the most important part of it all, I think, is just finding that partnership that you can trust to say, all right, we're going to have a conversation about what was impacted, how was it impacted, is there materiality here associated with this breach, or was it a random marketing server that had nothing on it, essentially?
And what I would chime in there is it's really important to define your incident response process. And this is going to sound strange, but most importantly around vocabulary. And what does that vocabulary, we had to do this at Salesforce. And so we had specific vocabulary. It started with an issue. We have an issue. And then we had a definition of what then constituted an incident. So we went from issue to incident. And then we had another definition of what goes from incident to breach. The reason we did that was, like any other platform, Salesforce would go down, right? And so what happens when it goes down? Who's the customer going to call first? They're going to call their salesperson. Well, we had salespeople kind of nonchalantly saying, yeah, I think we probably got hacked. and so was that helpful? And so we did this whole campaign about, if a customer calls, here's the only person or the only group that can answer, and here's the vocabulary, and don't use this word, et cetera, et cetera.
It's the joy
Thank
of
you.
security.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Jim,
No.
so much for joining and lending your expertise here today. Matt, likewise, once again, thank you to all of our attendees. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day and hope that the time was valuable for you. And we hope to see you on another webinar very soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.